Have you ever noticed how the more you understand, the heavier everything begins to feel, as if awareness itself has weight, as if seeing clearly comes with a quiet exhaustion that never fully leaves you? You were told that being intelligent would make life easier, that it would open doors, solve problems, protect you from confusion. And yet, here you are, often feeling tired in ways you can't quite explain, carrying thoughts that don't shut off, sensing tensions in rooms long before words are spoken, and wondering why clarity feels more like pressure than freedom. As a child, you may have been the one who asked too many questions, who noticed when adults contradicted themselves, who felt the unspoken moods in the house like changes in weather. While others played, you watched. While others accepted simple answers, you searched for what was missing. Your mind learned early how to connect dots, how to read between lines, how to sense what was wrong even when everyone pretended everything was fine. That early awareness felt like a gift then, but it also quietly taught you something dangerous, that understanding means responsibility, and that once you see something clearly, you can never unsee it. Now, as an adult, that same intelligence often feels like a mask you wear, and a shadow that follows you. You see patterns in people's behavior before they do. You anticipate outcomes, imagine consequences, replay conversations long after they end. Neuroscience tells us that highly intelligent minds tend to engage in deeper metacognition, constantly observing their own thoughts, simulating futures, revisiting the past. But knowing why it happens doesn't always make it easier to live with. Instead of feeling empowered, you often feel alone inside your own head, like you're carrying a map of the terrain while everyone else is just walking the road. In relationships, you notice cracks early. You sense emotional distance before it becomes visible. You understand people's wounds even when they hurt you, and that understanding traps you in empathy, making it harder to leave, harder to be angry, harder to feel simple. Attachment theory would say you learned early to read others closely, to stay safe, to adapt, to anticipate. But what it doesn't always say is how exhausting it is to always be the one who understands. And so intelligence becomes a paradox. It gives you depth, insight, and perspective, yet it also makes the world feel louder, heavier, more complicated. You start to wonder if something is wrong with you, if you're broken for feeling this way, if life is supposed to feel lighter than this. But what if this burden isn't a flaw at all? What if it's a pattern shaped slowly, predictably, from the moment awareness arrived too early and stayed too long? And what if understanding where it began is the first step toward learning how to carry it differently? Did you ever feel, even as a child, that you were somehow arriving too early to moments everyone else reached much later? Before anyone spoke, you could already sense the tension in the room, the sharp silence after a disagreement, the emotional weather shifting long before the storm arrived. While other children laughed freely, you watched faces, listened to tone, noticed what wasn't being said. Your intelligence did not first show itself in grades or praise, but in perception. You felt things before you understood them, and understood things you were never meant to carry so young. You were the child who asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Questions about fairness, about contradictions, about why love sometimes felt conditional, or why grown-ups said one thing and did another. Often there were no answers, only dismissals, or smiles meant to quiet you. Psychology tells us that children with heightened cognitive sensitivity often develop advanced emotional perception as a survival skill. Your brain learned to scan, to predict, to read between lines because clarity felt safer than confusion. But no one taught you what to do with what you saw. At home, you may have been praised for being smart, mature, or wise beyond your years. Those words sounded like love, but they came with an unspoken cost. You became the one who understood, the one who didn't need much, the one who adapted. Attachment theory would say that when emotional needs are inconsistently met, children learn to self-regulate early, to rely on awareness instead of comfort. You may have learned to parent yourself, to soothe your own fears, to stay quiet so others could stay stable. This is how intelligence quietly becomes a substitute for care. In classrooms, you were often ahead but also out of sync. Your mind raced while the world moved slowly. You noticed injustice when rules were meant to be accepted. You saw flaws in systems that were supposed to be trusted. Being advanced didn't feel like power, it felt like isolation. Like a garden that grew too quickly without enough water, your intellect expanded while your emotional roots struggled to deepen. Neuroscience shows that early heightened awareness strengthens neural pathways related to vigilance and prediction. Your brain learned to stay alert, to anticipate, to think instead of feel. Over time, this vigilance hardened into a habit. You didn't just observe the world, you monitored it. And in doing so, you slowly stepped out of it. What no one tells you is that this early awareness was not a choice, and it was not a flaw. It was a response, a brilliant adaptation to an environment that required you to see clearly before you were held gently. And as you grew, that same intelligence followed you forward, shaping how you love, how you protect yourself, and how you carry the weight of understanding. To see how this early pattern becomes a mask in adulthood, you have to follow awareness beyond childhood, into the life it quietly constructed for you. Have you noticed how, as an adult, you've learned to look calm even when your mind is racing at full speed, as if composure itself has become a costume you slip into every morning? From the outside, you appear capable, rational, steady. People trust you because you seem to have answers, because you speak with clarity, because you rarely fall apart in public. But beneath that surface, your thoughts never truly rest. They circle, replay, analyze, predict, like a spotlight that refuses to dim even when the room is empty. This is how early intelligence hardens into a mask. You learned long ago that showing too much depth makes people uncomfortable, that complexity slows conversations, that nuance is often mistaken for doubt. So you edit yourself. In meetings, you notice the cracks in ideas before they're praised, but you stay quiet because experience has taught you that seeing too far ahead makes you sound negative. Neuroscience calls this heightened executive functioning, a brain trained to simulate outcomes and monitor errors constantly. But living inside that vigilance feels like wearing an oxygen mask that never fully seals. You can breathe, but never deeply enough to relax. In relationships, this mask grows heavier. You can be sitting across from someone, listening, smiling, responding appropriately, while inside you feel both bored and lonely at the same time. You understand them too quickly. You see where the story is going. You sense the emotional patterns before they unfold. Attachment theory would suggest that when connection once required awareness, intimacy now feels safer when filtered through thought. You long to be surprised, to be met, but you also fear the exhaustion of explaining yourself fully, so you simplify. You shrink your inner world to fit the room. Sometimes, late at night, when the world finally quiets, the mask slips. Your thoughts grow louder, conversations replay with alternate responses, decisions branch into endless possibilities. You analyze what you should have said, what you didn't say, what it all means. Studies on rumination show that intelligent minds are more prone to this looping, not because they are weak, but because they are trained to keep searching for coherence. Yet coherence rarely brings peace. It only sharpens awareness of what's missing. Over time, intelligence becomes something you manage instead of celebrate. You learn when to hide it, when to dilute it, when to pretend you don't see what you see. The mask protects you from misunderstanding, but it also distances you from connection. You begin to wonder if anyone truly knows you, or if they only know the version of you that feels safe to reveal. And beneath that question lies something quieter and more unsettling. If your mind never turns off, what part of you has been waiting, unseen, in the shadow? To understand that, you have to look at what happens when intelligence stops serving you and starts working against you. Have you ever wondered why your mind doesn't simply think, but echoes? Why a single moment can replay itself again and again, as if your inner world has a volume knob that keeps turning up? Intelligence is often described as a shield, something meant to protect you from confusion or emotional chaos. But psychology tells a different story. A more accurate metaphor is amplification. The smarter the mind, the louder the signal it receives from life. From a neuroscientific perspective, intelligent minds tend to operate with higher cognitive complexity. This means you don't just register events, you layer them. You notice patterns beneath patterns, meanings beneath meanings. Your brain constantly simulates futures, revisits the past, and evaluates the present from multiple angles at once. Metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, becomes second nature. But living inside that awareness can feel like standing in a hall of mirrors, where every thought reflects into 10 more before you can rest. Studies have shown that heightened intelligence is often linked to increased sensitivity and emotional reactivity. Not because intelligent people feel more than others, but because they process more. You detect inconsistencies in words and actions. You sense emotional shifts before they're expressed. Your mind scans for coherence the way a nervous system scans for danger. What begins as insight quietly becomes vigilance, and vigilance over time becomes exhaustion. Imagine a child who once learned that noticing subtle changes kept them safe. That same brain grows up and never forgets the lesson. Attachment theory suggests that when emotional environments are unpredictable, the mind compensates by becoming hyper-aware. Intelligence steps in where reassurance once should have been. As an adult, this shows up as constant internal monitoring. Conversations replay. Decisions branch endlessly. The brain refuses to let go because letting go once felt dangerous. This is why intelligent people often struggle with rumination. You don't just remember what happened, you analyze why it happened, what it revealed, what it might lead to. Research on anxiety and existential thinking shows that higher intelligence correlates with deeper questioning about meaning, mortality, and purpose. While others can distract themselves, your mind insists on understanding. It pulls at threads until the fabric of certainty thins, leaving you alone with questions that have no clean answers. Emotionally, this amplification can feel like carrying a garden that grows faster than it can be watered. Thoughts bloom rapidly, but nourishment lags behind. Feelings deepen, but relief arrives slowly. Intelligence doesn't mute pain, it sharpens it, giving fear more language, loneliness more narrative, and resentment more justification. You don't just hurt, you understand you're hurt, and that understanding can trap you inside it. Seeing intelligence as an amplifier changes everything. It explains why insight doesn't always bring peace and why clarity can coexist with suffering. And once you recognize this, a more unsettling question emerges. What happens when an amplified mind turns its power inward, not to understand the world, but to judge itself? That is where the shadow begins to take shape. Have you ever felt your own mind quietly stand in your way, not with force, but with endless reasons? This is the moment when intelligence stops feeling like a gift and starts behaving like a shadow. What once helped you see clearly now watches everything you do with suspicion. Every decision enters an internal courtroom where evidence is examined, motives questioned, outcomes argued from every angle until certainty collapses under its own weight. You don't move forward because you're still thinking, and you're still thinking because moving forward feels dangerous. As a child, awareness kept you safe. As an adult, that same awareness can trap you. You see consequences before actions, risks before opportunities, endings before beginnings. Neuroscience tells us that highly analytical minds are better at error detection, but poor at tolerating ambiguity. Your brain hunts for the right choice, and when none appears, it delays. Overanalysis becomes paralysis. What looks like caution on the outside feels like suffocation on the inside. In relationships, this shadow grows sharper. You sense the potential for disappointment before intimacy deepens. You understand why someone might hurt you before they ever do. Attachment theory explains how intelligence can become a defense, allowing you to stay one step ahead emotionally. Never fully exposed, you rationalize distance as wisdom, detachment as maturity. But late at night, when the noise fades, loneliness creeps in quietly, asking questions your logic cannot silence. There is a particular cruelty in seeing too many sides of yourself. You stand in front of an internal mirror that reflects not one identity, but dozens. The confident version, the fearful one, the cynical observer, the hopeful child you keep hidden. With so many reflections, commitment becomes impossible. You hesitate to act because you can already hear your future self criticizing the choice. Studies on self-concept complexity show that when identity fragments too much, decision-making suffers. You become divided against yourself. Over time, intelligence learns to justify stagnation. You tell yourself you're waiting for clarity, for alignment, for the perfect moment, but what you're really avoiding is vulnerability. Acting would mean choosing one version of yourself and letting the others die quietly. It would mean risking being wrong, misunderstood, or ordinary. So the mind builds elegant arguments for staying exactly where you are, convincing you that restraint is wisdom, when it's often fear wearing a thoughtful disguise. This is not weakness, it is the dark echo of strength. The same mind that sees deeply can also wound deeply. The same awareness that understands the world can turn inward and become merciless. And as this shadow grows, it raises a larger question, one that cannot be answered with logic alone. If intelligence can sabotage you so effectively, what happens when the world around you begins to reward that sabotage instead of challenging it? Have you noticed how the world seems to move faster the moment you try to slow it down with a real question? Society doesn't just prefer simplicity, it rewards it. Confidence is praised more than curiosity. Speed is valued over depth. Certainty is celebrated even when it's fragile. And in a culture built on quick answers and clean narratives, your complexity can start to feel like a liability rather than a strength. From an early age, you begin to sense this pressure. In classrooms, the student who raises their hand with too many questions is quietly discouraged. At work, the person who sees flaws before solutions are finalized is labeled difficult. In relationships, the one who wants to explore emotions instead of smoothing them over is called too intense. Social psychology shows that groups favor cohesion over accuracy, comfort over truth. Nuance slows momentum, and momentum is what the system feeds on. So when you hesitate, reflect, or complicate the story, you stand out in the wrong way. As an adult, you learn to adapt. You edit yourself mid-sentence. You simplify your thoughts to fit the room. You nod along even when you sense the cracks forming beneath the surface. This is not dishonesty, it's survival. Neuroscience tells us the brain seeks belonging as much as meaning. When depth threatens connection, the nervous system chooses safety. You wear a social mask that keeps conversations light and expectations low, even as your inner world grows heavier. There is a quiet resentment that can form here. You watch certainty be mistaken for strength, loudness for leadership, simplicity for wisdom. You see how shallow confidence often rises faster than thoughtful hesitation. Philosophers have long warned that societies uncomfortable with complexity tend to punish those who carry it. Curiosity is reframed as instability. Reflection becomes indecision. Depth is pathologized, not because it is wrong, but because it is inconvenient. Over time, this conditioning reshapes how you see yourself. You start to wonder if something is wrong with you for feeling out of sync. You question whether your need to understand deeply is a flaw rather than a feature. Attachment patterns resurface here too, as you learn once again to adapt emotionally, to minimize needs, to stay agreeable so connection isn't threatened. Like a garden forced to grow in shallow soil, your inner life stretches sideways instead of deepening openly. The loneliness that follows is subtle but persistent. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Not because you are invisible, but because you've learned to hide the most alive parts of yourself. Society may reward your performance, but it rarely nourishes your truth. And as this gap widens between who you are and who you present, another question begins to surface, one that turns inward again. What does living this way cost you emotionally over time? Have you ever been surrounded by people and still felt profoundly alone, as if there were a glass wall between your inner world and everyone else's voices? This is the quiet cost of carrying a mind that understands too much. Intelligence does not spare you from pain. It often gives that pain sharper edges, clearer language, longer echoes. You don't just feel loneliness, you analyze it, trace its origins, and sit with it long after others have moved on. There are nights when the world finally grows still, and that's when the thoughts arrive. Conversations replay in your head with alternate endings. Messages are typed, rewritten, and never sent. You imagine what it would sound like to explain yourself fully, to be met without having to simplify or soften. But the imagined listener never quite appears. Neuroscience shows that rumination intensifies in quiet moments, when the brain, no longer distracted, turns inward. For you, silence doesn't soothe, it amplifies. In relationships, this loneliness has a particular ache. You may have been with people who admired your intelligence, but never truly reached you emotionally. You listened deeply, understood their wounds, anticipated their needs, yet felt unseen in return. Attachment theory suggests that when connection once required vigilance, intimacy can feel asymmetrical. You give understanding more easily than you receive it. Over time, resentment can quietly grow, not loud enough to break things, but heavy enough to hollow them out. There is also anxiety here, a low-grade hum that rarely switches off. You sense what might go wrong before it happens. You feel responsible for outcomes you cannot control. Studies link higher intelligence with increased anxiety, not because intelligent people are fragile, but because they perceive more variables. Your mind keeps watch like a sentry who never sleeps, guarding against threats that are sometimes real, sometimes imagined, but always exhausting. Even joy can feel incomplete. When something good happens, part of you is already anticipating its ending, its cost, its fragility. The monster within is subtle. It doesn't roar, it whispers. It tells you to stay guarded, to stay prepared, to never fully rest in the moment. Like a garden without enough water, your emotional life grows, but with strain, leaves curling inward despite their richness. This is the deepest paradox. Your intelligence gives you language for your pain, but language alone doesn't heal it. Understanding does not automatically lead to connection. And so you carry this quiet ache, wondering if anyone will ever truly see you, without needing translation. Yet within this loneliness lies an important truth, one that shifts the story forward. Pain that is understood can also be transformed, if you learn not just to think differently, but to relate differently to your own mind. What if the problem was never your intelligence, but the way you were taught to carry it alone? Somewhere along the way, you learned that thinking more was the answer to feeling more, that understanding would eventually quiet the ache. But a powerful mind was never meant to live only in thought. It was meant to be integrated, grounded, allowed to rest inside the body it inhabits. As a child, thinking kept you safe. As an adult, it kept you functional. But now, it may be time to let it keep you human. Neuroscience shows that the nervous system does not calm through insight alone. It calms through presence, through sensation, through moments where the mind steps back and allows the body to speak. When you notice your breath, your posture, the weight of your feet on the ground, you are not abandoning intelligence. You are giving it a place to land. This is where boundaries begin, not with people first, but with rumination. You start to notice when thought becomes repetition rather than insight, when analysis turns into self-punishment. Attachment theory reminds us that safety is not only found in others, but in how reliably we return to ourselves. Each time you choose not to replay a moment endlessly, each time you allow uncertainty to exist without solving it, you teach your mind that the world will not collapse if it loosens its grip. In relationships, this shift feels subtle but profound. You stop performing understanding as proof of worth. You allow pauses in conversation. You let yourself be imperfect, unpolished, occasionally misunderstood. Choosing depth over approval means accepting that not everyone will follow you into your inner world, and that this is not rejection, but reality. The mask softens, the shadow retreats slightly. You begin to show up not as the most insightful version of yourself, but as the most honest one. There is grief here too. Grief for the years spent believing you had to earn rest, connection, or love through comprehension. Grief for the child who learned too early that being aware meant being alone. But grief is not failure. It is integration. Like a garden finally receiving water after a long drought, your emotional life does not need to grow faster. It needs to grow kinder. Living with a powerful mind is not about turning it off. It is about learning when to listen and when to let silence speak, when to think and when to simply be. And as this balance begins to form, another realization quietly emerges, one that carries you toward the end of this journey. Intelligence was never meant to save you from life's weight, but to help you carry it with wisdom. Have you ever wondered if the reason intelligence feels heavy is because it was never designed to make you comfortable, only awake? From the beginning, your mind has acted like a lens that sharpens everything it touches. It does not soften pain or simplify truth. It reveals complexity, contradiction, and depth all at once. And once you see the world this way, there is no returning to innocence. You don't get to unlearn what you understand. You only learn how to carry it. As a child, awareness arrived early, like light flooding a room before your eyes were ready. As an adult, that same light followed you into relationships, work, solitude, and doubt. You saw beauty where others rushed past. You felt pain where others felt inconvenience. You questioned meanings others accepted. Philosophy has always warned that clarity comes with cost. To see clearly is to stand closer to reality, and reality is never gentle for long. Intelligence, then, is not a privilege meant to elevate you above others. It is a responsibility that asks something of you. It asks you to hold paradox without collapsing into cynicism, to feel deeply without hardening, to think clearly without turning thought into a weapon against yourself. The monster within is not intelligence itself, but the belief that you must use it to control life instead of understand it. When intelligence tries to dominate experience, it becomes cruel. When it learns to accompany experience, it becomes wise. Neuroscience tells us the brain is plastic, shaped by how we relate to our thoughts. Attachment theory reminds us that safety is learned, not inherited. In the same way, wisdom is not intelligence refined, but intelligence softened by compassion. The mask you wore to survive can be set down. The shadow you feared can be integrated. Even the garden that once grew without water can bloom again, when tended with patience rather than pressure. You were never meant to escape your mind. You were meant to inhabit it fully, to let it show you pain without letting pain define you, to let it reveal truth without demanding certainty, to accept that loneliness, fear, and longing are not signs of failure, but signals of depth, signals that you are alive to the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. Perhaps the most honest truth is this: intelligence was never meant to make life easy. It was meant to make life meaningful. And meaning does not arrive through comfort, but through courage. The courage to stay present, the courage to feel without retreating, the courage to carry what you see with humility and care. When you stop asking intelligence to protect you from life and instead allow it to guide you through life, something quiet shifts. The weight doesn't disappear, but it becomes bearable. And in that bearing, you discover that wisdom is not the absence of struggle, but the ability to walk with it, awake, compassionate, and whole.